Hey guys, Mathew Lighty here, and this is my build guide for Archmage Scion Arc, and it's intended for 3.24 Necropolis. So yeah, it's going to be a great time. The build's going to be super fun, and let's get into the TLDR of what the fuck this is. So Archmage is an archetype of build that revolves around having a very large mana pool and converting that large amount of mana to flat lightning damage, and then utilizing that massive mana pool in conjunction with things like Mind Over Matter and Agnostic to effectively make our mana our effective health pool. So big mana build. I was going to showcase this built in standard on a Scion just to have some footage, not that it even matters, right? But then my only Scion is already built and prepped for 5-way Legion farming. So yeah, no, I'm not going to unbuild this fucker for the demonstration. So you just watch the PoE planner. I assure you all the information will be there. The footage is fucking irrelevant. So before we go over the actual build, let's dive into a brief history of Archmage, just to show the youngsters what the build's all about. Archmage was introduced in March. All right, let's go over the gems. Okay, so Archmage, like we discussed, is something that lets us dump our mana effectively into lightning damage. We gain damage equal to a large portion, 75% of the mana cost, and we can crank up the mana cost and do a whole bunch of shenanigans like this. So we utilize a lot of things that have more multipliers, a lot of things that, even on the passive tree, give us more mana. For example, there's a section over here called Forethought. This increases our mana cost, which in turn increases our damage. But everything's kind of based around Archmage. Now, the other gems in this build are used to supplement that. So because of Archmage, we want to have a very large open mana pool. So we utilize Eternal Blessing, which gives us one free aura that would have been reserving mana, but we can't reserve mana after that. So we use Wrath. If at any point in time you feel like you have enough damage, or you maybe want more defenses, you could easily substitute Wrath with Determination, Purity of Elements, whatever you choose. On top of that, we run Clarity linked with Arrogance, because that lets us still use Eternal Blessing, just to give us a lot of flat mana regen. And, we don't have a lot of life, and it doesn't matter too much, so it doesn't really matter that we're investing into Arrogance there. That takes up a chunk of our life pool, but it's okay. Now, the other gems we use that are super important are Arcane Cloak and Sigil of Power. Now, Arcane Cloak is a guard skill. Previously, what you would do is you would put Arcane Cloak on your left click or your walk, and it would just trigger, have an uptime and a minor downtime. And what this does is it takes a very large chunk of our mana pool, gets converted into a damage mitigation system. So that it also grants us a bunch of lightning damage. So it's 75% damage from hits is taken from the Arcane Cloak before our life or ES. So this is like a huge way of protecting us and utilizing our mana and giving us some damage, okay? Importantly, the cooldown does not recover during its effect. So although you could reduce its cooldown by using things like reducing guard skills, there's no way, to my knowledge, to get this so it ever has 100% uptime. There will be small points of downtime. And we'll be using the new Automation Support gem, which I don't think is here. Probably in Path of Building. It doesn't fucking matter. You just have to run this in a 4-link. With increased duration, Arcane Cloak, Arcane Surge. Give it a little bit extra oomph on your mana. And keeps your Arcane Surge up, and Automation Support to make it well automated. If you want to, you could manually cast it. That's up to you, but I would just automate it. On top of that, we also have Sigil of Power. Now, Sigil of Power is the equivalent of what melee totems are for melee builds on steroids. Now, I have this in the notes section, so there's a lot of notes I have here. You'll have access to all these, obviously. And it talks about what they are. Sigil of Power grants 28 to 564 added damage, and enemies do 23% less damage when you're at maximum stages, which takes 3 seconds, okay? Now, that's fucking crazy of a buff, but the problem is it's a physical area on the ground, which is why we link it with things like increased AoE. It literally puts a fucking giant circle on the ground. We stand on it. When we spend mana, it advances stages. You can advance to the second stage immediately, but there's a minor amount of ramp up there. So basically, this is just for single target purposes, our big giga damage and defense button on top of the existing things like Arcane Cloak. All right, so you have our main link setup, which is linked to Archmage. I'm using Arc. That's the traditional one. Valarc is very, very, very strong. We can no longer link Archmage to brands or orbs, so you're limited to what you could use. You could use Ball Lightning. You could use any lightning skill you have preferences towards. And again, for your links, I have things like Unleash Shear, but there's a whole subsection discussing Spell Echo versus Unleash. A lot of it's preference. A lot of it's just kind of what you feel is best. So there's some wiggle room there. And again, you can go crit if you want to or not crit. I think not crit's easier, especially in a league start. The other gems I like to use as an Arcanist brand setup. This has just a Curse, Frostbomb, and Culling Strike. It's a nice little setup that gives you effectively 10% more damage from that, a bunch of more damage from Connectivity, and then Frostbomb, as we all know, when doing things like Maven, Witnessed Encounters, having the enemy regenning constantly. Big bummer. I just like to put that on some sort of automated setup. Now, you could automate all of this further without using Arcanist brand by using some other items like the helmet, Katava's Thirst. Again, this build is like, every choice you make in this build, for the most part, is a little bit complicated. I'd like to preface most of the conversations with that, is this is a build that has a lot of preferential decisions and a lot of decisions based on what sort of content you're engaging with, the level of automation you want, what you're trying to get out of it. But the baseline of using Archmage doesn't particularly change. But like Crown of the Inward Eye is a better helmet, but Katava's Thirst lets you automate things, so that's where it comes to preference. I digress. So that's the basic gem setup. If you want to have some cast when damage takens, or cast when stuns, or additional support things linked to your Sigils of Power, additional things in your automated brand setups or running automation itself, feel free. And again, you could wiggle out of the main 6-link of your Archmage setup if you so choose. We're going to go on now to the skill tree. So, the passive tree for this build is a little bit funky. I'm picking a Scion just because I wanted to play a Scion. And there are some positives to Scion, but there are more negatives than compared to what I would consider the more superior class for Archmage, which is Hierophant. Nothing really changes in the tree. You just start from here and you probably wouldn't path down to all this suppression stuff. So the main draw of Scion is access to more suppression and access to things like Pathfinder or Raider, if you want. Our version of the Hierophant is not as great as their version of the Hierophant, since they are, a Hierophant. But that being said, Scion's totally fine. So, again, we're picking up mostly mana. A lot of mana. A lot of damage recoup and mana. A lot of mana and guard skill duration. Arcane Cloak is a guard skill. Grabbing Iron Will, because there's no reason not to for 1 point. We do end up with a decent chunk of strength. We also have a lot of flat, so the strength bonus, which is a percentage scaling applying to our spells, has somewhat of an added value, because we have so much flat coming from Archmage, coming from Cloak, coming from Sigil, that we want percent. Path of Exile is a game that is based around a natural balance of more multipliers and added multipliers. If you have all of one, the other one doesn't really do as much. You need like a natural balance. So you can't just have nothing but more multipliers. You can't have nothing but added. You need a little bit of give and take, which I think is very poetic, Now, we pick up Ash, Frost, and Storm just because it's simply an efficient node. And since we run exposure on hit on our gloves as part of our Eldritch implicits, we get free exposure at whatever percent. The roll doesn't matter, because it's going to be pushed to a minimum of 18%. So that's pretty good. This next node is tricky, and then when I talk about this build is based off decisions, this is one of them. You're either going to take Dreamer for reducing your mana cost, or you're going to take Forethought for increasing your mana cost. This decision is solely based on how your gear feels at any given point in time. Depending on what your gear feels like, this is going to feel different. You might want more mana to do more damage. You might want less mana cost to have your agnostic and mind over matter be more manageable. That's just preference and decision making. Coming up to quick recovery, simply efficient life, mana recovery, etc. The masteries for life we're running are the life, and also I think this one's wrong. I wanted to have the 15% because our Cloak of Defiance, I don't know if that has a life tag. I can't recall. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. We'll check that out later. We're picking up Mind Over Matter. And again, the build uses Cloak of Defiance. So I don't know. You don't need to pick up Mind Over Matter once you have a Cloak of Defiance. But until that point in time, you just pick up Mind Over Matter because it saves you a point eventually. Going into the Witch starting area, Lightning Walker for effective damage, Heart and Soul for mana life. Just a lot of effective points here. Again, mana, more mana, more mana, a little bit of life, mana. You can see a pattern. And then we got a Lightning Mastery because increases and reductions to mana also apply to Shock Effect. That sounds fantastic, right? We have so much increased reduction in mana, so that's a bunch of free Shock Effect. And as we have ways of shocking through things like conductivity, etc. Even if we don't crit often, and then we have Elemental Overload, so when we do crit, it's just a bunch of free damage. You can kind of see the sort of synergy happening here. Now, working our way down the left side, we have the Arcane Capacitor node, which is more Arcane Surge effect, almost always active. We always have Arcane Surge, we're always spending mana. Fantastic. On top of that, we just pick up Devotion, which you'll notice says increased mana, which normally says life. That's because we run a Healthy Mind Jewel. This converts life to mana at double values, and itself gives 20% mana. This jewel is acquired by valuing Cobalt Jewels, and it's not that rare. So I have it again in the notes section. I highly recommend checking this, and it'll be updated fully. If there's any typos or mistakes, I'll amend them. This, you want to add to your filter uncorrupted Cobalt Jewels, because they start dropping fairly early on, and you want to be valuing them for Healthy Minds and Solo Self-Found. I would keep them on your filter until you hit a 20% Healthy Mind. It'll happen eventually, so be patient. Now, we also get to hear this important node, Agnostic. This is one of the key components of the build. This is a massive defensive layer for Archmage. What this does is it makes your maximum energy shield 0, and when not on full life, sacrifice 20% of mana per second to recover that much life. I've just remembered something. So, earlier we have Clarity mixed with Arrogance. This is allocating a portion of your life pool. Oh, you know what? That's not why. I'm working in circles, but I'm making sense to myself. When not on full life, sacrifice mana per second to recover that much life. So, if you're on full life, you start sacrificing. We have it so our life mastery is set to be 90% counts as full to give us a bit of a buffer for Agnostic to trigger because we have an amount of life regen, so we don't want it gobbling all of our mana if we're basically full. That's why I had that in there. Past Lighty is so smart, I think. This seems right. Alright. You notice that the tree is 87 points. There's a reason for that. I have a lot of jewel sockets that aren't allocated, or I'm walking next to them and I haven't gotten them. The reason for that is this build thrives off of jewel sockets, and there's a couple decisions you can make. One decision that I think I'll be taking is pathing down to Unwavering Stance. We have an incredibly small life pool because we have an incredibly large mana pool, and because the most of our damage we're taking is being Agnostic back or Mind Over Mattered in some way, our mana pool is our effective life pool. But because our life pool is so small, when we get tickled, we get stunned. Now, does that matter if we're getting chain stunned? Kind of. We could have cast one stun triggers and do things with that, but personally, I'd rather just have Unwavering Stance and then not be stunned anyway. The strength isn't a dead stat. It's actually effective pathing in a way because we're grabbing a jewel socket for a discounted point. And because of, Iron Will, our strength gives us damage. So it feels okay. I would recommend this if you're not going to go a cast one stunned route. Now let's get back to the jewel sockets, because again, this is complicated. Oh, I guess I could mention also Scion. Since we're Scion, we spec into Raider, which I think eventually all roads lead to Pathfinder because flasks are just OP. But I like Raider early on for the suppression for the movement speed. I think that's super good. And it's just because we can start Raider, we can get this entire starting area, which gives us a nice chunk of dex actually. 130 on tree covers our stats between that and strength. And we just get a bunch of movement speed and suppression. And through that, plus Mage Bane, we can get to suppression cap fairly easily. I think that's worthwhile as a Scion. I digress. This build has a lot of fucky choices for gear. I'll briefly go over the equipment because there's not much to talk about until we get to jewels, then it's a clusterfuck. So, your rings, your belt, your gloves, your boots, your weapons, all rare. The only real unique slot you run is Cloak of Defiance, a Adziri's Foible, and a Crown of the Inward Eye, or a Katavas. Katavas gives you more automation, Crown of the Inward Eye gives you more damage. Foible, simply extremely efficient. Boy oh boy, it's extremely efficient. It's just mana, and then more mana and more mana, and the attribute requirement reduction means our base skill stats on tree totally covers our gems. Cloak of Defiance, kind of the same thing. It's a bunch of mana on mana on mana. Feels great. Again, 1% mana regen doesn't sound like a lot until you have 10,000, and then, oh, it is a lot, and the amount of flat you get. They're just efficient uniques. Just efficient uniques, feels good. You can run rares until you have them. Thankfully, Cloak is not a tier 1. Foible is not a tier 1. Actually, I could be speaking out of my ass. Let's just double check real quick. My good friends at PoE Ladder have a lovely section here where they showcase what all the tiers are. So let's look for Cloak of Defiance. I spelt that so wrong. Cloak of Defiance is tier 2, so not to worry there. And Foible is tier 2 also. Alright, so you're going to have to work a little bit for them, but they're not ridiculous in solo self-found. In trade, you just buy them. They're not that expensive. Maybe a Divine the first week, but not going to go crazy. Crown of the Inward Eye drops off Cirrus. Most common drop. Not a problem. Cool. Alright, let's get into the fuck fest. That is the jewels here. I have a whole subsection for jewels because the jewels are a problem. Not their problem, but they're, you know, it's a lot. So, you could basically use every unique jewel in the game on this build, and in certain places it's actually very, very strong. So, one example of that is Transcendent Mind. You could put north of Witch if you allocate a certain direction. So let's show you what that looks like. If we put a Transcendent Mind, which is acquired from Incursion and then upgrading it, over here, what this does is it gives us mana regen per intelligence allocated and then reduced if not at a 3-to-2 ratio, meaning per each point you have in, you're actually gaining net regen, okay? And you're gaining dot multi, which is useless, but we're losing flat int. This is only good right here, and it's only good if you have basically all of these int nodes, okay? If you have those top int nodes, this gives you 30% increased mana recovery rate. That's great. However, we lose 100 int, and, you know, it's like, is it worth it? Only if you were going to go to these nodes anyway. So, Heart of Thunder, great, get it, sure. Disciple of the Forbidden, if you were playing crit, sure. Otherwise, you're spending 10% for an extra, what is that, 5%? Is it worth it? Hard to say. I don't really know, and I don't think it is. I would only do this if you're charge stacking, otherwise wouldn't bother putting Transcendent Mind there. What you can put here is a Lethal Pride. Now, a Lethal Pride is not bad. It gives you a bunch of strength, and it also hits, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notables. Those can have things like double damage or percent strength, which again gives us damage through Iron Will, so pretty good. Those are the easy ones. It starts getting a little fucky now, because you have a Natural Instinct, you have Might of the Meek, and you have Healthy Mind, which we have someplace else. So, Healthy Mind is over here. That's all fun and well. What you can also do is you could run a Might of the Meek down here, and you could run on the left side here either Unnatural Instinct to get double value out of the Might of the Meek, since the Might is reaching things that Unnatural is giving you double of. Okay? Or, instead of doing that, you could swap the Unnatural into Healthy Mind, right? And pick up these nodes, which normally give 5 life, which would turn to 10 life, but now turn to 15 mana for a double boil and trouble conversion. So all these small nodes are totally souped up from Might of the Meek being touched, and then you could utilize Healthy Mind to get way more bang for your buck at 15% mana per point. Constitution giving 30% increased mana because it's within reach of Healthy Mind. Isn't that Absolutely nuts. So you could do things like that with Scion. I think that's where it really starts popping off. I know that we've gone real deep, and it's kind of gotten a little bit wonky, but that's the gist of this build, is a lot of cool interactions in min-maxing. And there's Watcher's Eyes that are cool. There's Kurgle Gaze. You could do Adorned. You could do thread things. You could place a thread over here on the left if you wanted. Okay, and this thread lets you reach Agnostic, lets you reach Arcane Capacitor, lets you reach Holy Dominion, lets you reach Sanctum of Thought. There's a lot of good unique jewels for this build. So I think that's a super enjoyable part of this, is min-maxing it to this kind of wonky extent. I'm trying to think of what else I want to talk about, because there's not much else to discuss, I don't think. I would recommend checking this note section to double check what I've been talking about as far as the interactions. This is a bit of an information dump, and in this equipment section I just kind of haphazardly put on some like okay to mediocre starter gear. But the gist of the build is quite simple. We get a fuck ton of mana, make sure we're res capped, and then our gems kind of take over. Between Sigil of Power, Arcane Link, Archmage, we just kind of pop off. And there's a lot of, figuring out while leveling when to invest into Mind Over Matter, when to spec into Agnostic. And you know what? That's part of it. You're just going to have to put your hands on the wheel, per se. And again, if you don't want to play Scion, I wouldn't recommend it unless you just decide to like Scion, because, Hierophant is just better. They have Divine Guidance, which has Transfiguration of Mind built in. They have Sanctuary of Thought built in. They have a lot of cool stuff built in for Arcane Surge. I think it's probably better, but not that much better. There's definitely some cool things about Scion as far as getting the suppression cap and being a little bit faster. So, yeah, you could check P.O Ninja and you'll have 80% Hierophants for playing Mind Over Matter Agnostic Archmage build. I think it'll be a little bit of a different tale this league, especially because you can't use brands. I think a lot of the love for that was having Sign of Purpose, because it made your brands fucking crazy, and, that sort of stuff. But no more brands, no more Archmage, Totem, Orb of Storms, Ball Lightning stuff. I think Scion will be better. So that's it. That's the gist of it. I say just as if that wasn't 20 minutes of pure information seeped into you, like I just Gojo domain expansion and Infinite Void into your fucking mind. But that's the basis for my Archmage plan. The tree is set to be level 92 with jewel sockets that are empty, so very easy to have this sort of tree if we were to just call the unnecessary jewel sockets, as I'll call them, in the very beginning, down to a meager 87, totally manageable in launch weekend on Solo Self-Found. And yeah, I would work on, if you're concerned about what league mechanics to invest in, things like Essence, things like ROG, things like Necropolis, because you want to get rare crafts that are decent. For example, again, these gloves is what I would defer. I would just say, look at this. This is a perfectly decent piece for Agnostic, and decent is all we're going to look for. And then if you want to magic find your way into a Cloak of Defiance, a Foible, you could do things like Ghosted Exiles, or again, just do Expedition, use your Gwens on this, and then your Rogs on this, and you'll be off to the races. So that's it. I'm Matt Lighty. This has been Archmage, Arc, Scion. If you don't want to Arc, you don't have to, but you're going to have to Archmage if you want to play the build I'm playing. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. If you have any suggestions or comments, if they're worthwhile, I'll add them to the notes section and amend stuff as I go on. As launch weekend is happening, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, each night, I will be adjusting this, amending this, and making anything that requires notation in here. There's going to be a lot of things I'll be testing out. Again, things such as Echo versus Unleash. Which one feels better? Don't know yet. Depends on preference. So that's it. If you have any questions, again, feel free to ask them. I'm Matt Lighty. Have a good day. I'll see you guys in Necropolis League. Bye-bye.